Fine. So in last lecture, we started this topic, that is IO and disk management. And we basically look at this some type of IO devices that we have in our systems. And basically we divided them in three different categories. So just to revise that, let me show it here. So the main three categories where we classify this device is IO devices, that is human readable, machine readable, and communications based IO devices. And then we discuss a little bit about that, which is simple to understand. So then now we'll start with this organization of this IO function, how this IO function gets organized, and what is IO function. So before that, let us understand the techniques for performing IO, which is evolved. Okay, how this IO gets performed. So mainly there are three types: programmed IO technique, interrupt driven IO, and direct memory access. Now, what is this? Basically, you can see that in programmed IO, there is no interrupt, and processor handles all these IO functions. Whatever IO needs to be done, that is handled by processor. Okay, so for example, you need to do memory transfer, right? You need to do some transfer between IO and memory. So IO to memory transfer through processor, and there is no interrupt. That is called programmed IO. Then we have interrupt driven IO, where it is similar to this programmed IO, where processor is going to be involved. It is through only processor that processor will instruct IO module to transfer some data from memory to IO. So processor is still involved. The only thing is now processor is not waiting for that transfer to be completed before it can continue executing the process. Okay. Here what happens when processor says that this particular transfer should be done between memory and IO. Okay. At that time, processor is now waiting. It is in a kind of waiting state. It cannot proceed further. It needs to wait for that IO to be completed. But with this idea of interrupt, what happened now? Processor asked to do this thing, that convert, transfer something between IO and memory, and then it will put that process in a block state, and it can execute another process. And when that IO will be completed, interrupt will be generated and given to the processor, and processor will understand, okay, this thing is done. So that is interrupt based IO, interrupt driven IO. And after that, the idea about DMA that came, and DMA is like a different module. So now whatever needs to be done between IO and memory, so whenever you need to transfer anything, data between IO and memory, that will be handled completely by DMA. Processor just needs to instruct the DMA that you need to do this. That's it. And once it is completed, DMA will tell back the processor that this is done. So this complete IO will not be handled by this processor. Processor just need to instruct the DMA module, that is direct memory access module. Now, how this IO function got evolved? It means how it was started and where it is right now. So initially, processor was directly controlling a peripheral device. All IO devices were handled by processor only, be it monitor, be it keyboard, mouse, whatever. Processor was handling all these devices. Then come controller or IO module. Later on, a special module was added in the OS and hardware, that is IO module or controller. So in that case, now this processor started using that uh, IO module and using programmed IO without interrupt. So it was using this programmed IO technique. Processor was, telling the IO module that this is required from the memory, or you need to pass this to memory or something like that. So there is something called IO module, and that was used by processor to do IO operations. And in that case, processor does not need to handle details of external devices. Previously, what was happening? Processor was handling all the details of the external devices, IO devices. But now, with the help of IO module, or IO module is one type of controller. It's a hardware plus software. So processor now need not to worry about that. It just need to do it through IO module. Later on, with this programmed IO, when the IO module was there, processor first using programmed IO. where processor was involved in every instruction. But then interrupt idea came, and now processor, it will tell the do something between IO and IO. It will tell the IO module to do something, and then it will wait. That interrupt came, and I'll start this process again. So interrupt was added basically. Then came direct memory access. In this direct memory access, again, as I told you, now processor is not involved in all the steps. It simply tell the DMA module to do something, and then DMA will tell back the processor that something is done. So it is passing, processor is passing its job to DMA for this particular IO stuff. Now, even after this DMA, if you see in DMA, blocks of data are moved into memory without involving the processor. So whatever transfer is happening between IO device and memory, whatever transfer, whatever data transfer happens, processor is not involved in that. Only it is processor only involved at the beginning and at the end. Beginning, it will tell the DMA to do something, and at the end, DMA tell the processor back that, okay, this is done. Further, it was modified, and now IO module is a separate processor. So basically, when I say IO module is a separate processor, what does it mean? So in this case, CPU directs the IO processor. Now, IO is one type of specialized processor. You have your own processor, CPU, which we call okay. So this CPU basically it directs the IO processor, which is a specialized processor, to execute an IO program in main memory. So now there is IO program which will do all this stuff. So that was added. Some few things were that was added. So that was one thing, and then further improvement in that IO processor. What was that? That IO module now has its own local memory. Now it is also having its own memory, like registers and other stuff. And this is commonly used to control communications with interactive terminals. So this is how this IO functions got evolved. It was started simply where processor was doing all the stuff. Whenever IO needs to be done, everything was handled by processor, and it ends at the point where now you have your separate IO processor in the system. Processor, your actual processor, that is your central processing unit, CPU, it will simply tell that IO processor that this stuff needs to be done, and everything is handled there. And a brief about direct memory access. If we talk about direct memory access, so this is a special type of module that you have in your system. Processor delegates IO operation to the DMA module, and DMA module transfers data directly to or from memory. So whenever memory, you need to transfer data between IO device and memory, there is a module called DMA module. Nowadays, this DMA is not the only thing. You have full-fledged IO processor, which includes DMA also. So it does that. And when complete, DMA module sends an interrupt signal to the processor. And you may have this different DMA configurations. Let's not get into the detail of this hardware part. Okay, how this DMA gets organized, that is not our concern right now. Okay, so I'm just keeping these 3 slides. We are more interested in this part, operating system design issues related to IO. Okay, this design issues that we are discussing, it is related to IO. So one goal of this OS design is to get efficient performance or efficiency. So when we talk about IO, most IO devices are extremely slow when you compare it to the main memory or processor, because the speed of main memory and the processor is far higher than the IO device's speed. So use of multi-programming allows for some processes to be waiting on IO while another process executes. So now what happens, as IO are very slow operations. So when some process is doing some IO operation, definitely that process will be blocked. It will be in waiting state. and processor will execute another process, and that is possible through multi-programming. And IO cannot keep up with processor speed. As I told you, IO are extremely slow and processor are extremely fast. So what is required to be done? So sometimes you need to swap. So swapping used to bring in ready processes. So that is possible. That even all processes in your system, in your memory, they are blocked because they are doing some one or other IO, and they all are blocked. So what processor will do now if all processes are blocked? So we have seen that when that happens, some of the processes get swapped out and new processes are brought in. Okay. But if you think about this, that all processes which are blocked on IO, some type of IO, now you need to swap out one of the process so that you can free some main memory and you can bring in new process. But to swap out the process, and where you swap it out? You swap it out on the secondary memory. But this swap out this process itself is an IO operation. Okay, that itself is an IO operation to swap out the process. All your processes are waiting for IO operation. For that, you need to remove one of the process and put it into the secondary memory. But to do that, that is also it is itself an IO operation. So that is a problem actually. So how you get this efficient? How you can do this efficiently? So that is one issue. Another issue is generality. How to achieve generality? Now, what is generality? For simplicity and freedom from error, it is desirable to handle all IO devices in a uniform manner. Whatever type of IO device it is, you just want to handle that IO device in a uniform manner. But that is not possible. Okay, that is not possible because all IO devices are different. They are having different physical structure. They are having different ways to perform the things, right? So when you want to achieve generality, what you want to achieve? Hide most of the details of device IO in lower level routines. So there should be some abstraction, and difficult to completely generalize, but can use a hierarchical modular design of IO functions. So if I tell you one thing, let's say you want to do some write operation. Maybe you want to write on the screen, or maybe you want to write on the hard disk. Ultimately, it is write operation. That kind of abstraction you want to achieve. You don't want to get into the detail as a user programmer. You don't want to get into the detail that how I can put data on hard disk or how I can put data on the screen. You want some interface which can do this job, which can simplify this job for a programmer. So there is requirement of hierarchical organization. So this is hierarchical design. A hierarchical philosophy leads to organizing an OS into different layers, and each layer relies on the next lower layer to perform more primitive functions. So let us directly go to this. Let me show some of the possible designs. See, these are very general designs, and according to the, in different OS, maybe these are customized. There are some customized designs, but these are very general discussion that we are doing for this OS design. What can be done by IO perspective? What kind of design you can have? So your program, when it is running, it is a user process, and it wants to work with your IO device. IO device itself is an hardware. So what can be there? Some layers can be there, which makes your job simple. For example, logical IO. Okay. So this logical IO layer of the OS, it makes your job easy to deal with IO devices. Now, all the operations that you want to perform on that IO device, maybe read, write, or whatever. Okay. So you can see at this layer, as a process, as a user process, you can see IO device itself in a logical form. So it's a logical resource where you can read, or from where you can write, something like that. So you just need to say, I want to read from disk, I want to write to the disk, something like that. Logical organization. Then below that you have device IO. What this device IO layer does, it converts requested operations into sequence of IO instructions. See, to read from the hard disk and to read from other device, maybe USB drive or whatever. Okay. For you, it's simple logical IO that you want to read. But then how to read. Specialized instructions are required to read from hard disk. Specialized instructions are required, and if you want to read from USB drive, then there's a there's a different instruction. So this device IO, it converts the operation that user wants to perform in actual IO sequences. That is device IO. And finally, you have below that, once instructions are generated for particular IO device, whatever instructions are generated, they will be scheduled and controlled at this point. So it will perform actual queuing and control operations of those instructions. So this is very higher level view, you can say, of the OS from IO perspective. This is one possible design. This is local peripheral device. This design is suitable for the local peripheral devices. Then if we talk about communication port as IO device, what kind of design is more suitable for this? So whatever networking you do, right? Nowadays we all are using Wi-Fi, but even if you might have seen in your lab Ethernet ports, RJ45. Okay, that is hardware. So Wi-Fi ports are there, Ethernet ports are there. They are communication ports, and they are also one kind of IO device. So how OS handles this type of IO devices? So more or less it is similar to the previous one, but instead of logical IO, now there is something called whole layer called communication architecture. Okay, and this is nothing but you might have learned, or you are going to learn TCP/IP in computer networks. So that TCP/IP layering whole thing is lying at this point. Okay, so process deals with that architecture, communication architecture like TCP/IP layers, which again deals with a device IO and then scheduling and control. So it is more or less like previous one. The only thing is, instead of logical IO, now it is itself a full architecture, communication architecture. Like example is TCP/IP layering. Then another perspective, file system perspective, because you are working with files which are stored on hard disk. Okay, so if we talk about that perspective, what kind of hierarchical design can be there? So again, there are few layers which are added. User process deals with directory management module. Directory management layer will deal with file system module. File system deal with physical organization, then device IO, and then scheduling and control. So these two last layers are very similar because that is nothing but actually they form device driver. These two last layer, they form device drivers. For every device you have specialized driver, and above that you have some other abstraction. According to the type of IO device, you have some different abstraction, and these are very generalized designs. According to the different, I mean, in different OS, this may be vary little bit from here to one or more layers are maybe different, but in general, it looks something like this. Now, what these three are: directory management. So basically, it is concerned with user operations which are affecting files. I want to read this directory, I want to get into this directory, or something like that. Then you have file system. This is the topic of the next chapter. Basically, file systems, you might have heard about different file systems on different operating system. NTFS on Windows or EXTs on Linux. Previously on Windows, it was using FAT16 and FAT32 and all those stuff. So they are file system. Basically, it's a logical organization of the files. So it's a logical structures and operations. And then below that, this file system is a logical operation, logical structure. But ultimately, how these files are stored on actual device, on hard disk, that is physical organization. So this file system handles all those physical, I mean, dealing with that actual storage of the files. So this is basically a design of your OS layers for different types of IO. And these are very generalized designs. Now, one concept that we need to understand is IO buffering. Let me tell you one thing. Let me ask you one thing. See, what is when I say IO buffering? Okay, let me show it here rather. If I can show it in this figure. Okay, before that, let's complete this part. What is IO buffering? So processes must wait for IO to complete before proceeding. If any process needs to do some IO, before it can proceed further, first it needs to wait for that IO to be completed. And that IO can be any type of IO. Read write to hard disk or printer, maybe some other devices, communication, anything. Now, there is one thing that you need to understand. For an example, let's say uh, you want to do some transfer from secondary memory to main memory in your process. You want to load some data, maybe you want to open some file data or something like that. Now, your process which wants to load data in your own process, okay, it is an IO operation. But as it is an IO operation, process will be blocked. And as process is blocked, it is possible that the process will be swapped out on the secondary memory. If process is swapped out, it means whatever frames, page frames were allocated to that process, they have gone out. They have stored on the secondary memory, on the virtual memory. Now, what is your IO operation? You want to load some data, but that data needs to be loaded in the pages or the frames which are allocated to your process. But now there is no frame. There is no frame which is allocated to your process. So where this data will be loaded from the secondary memory. And this is basically kind of deadlock. Why? Because when IO module which is requested by your process to load some data for you, it is waiting for you to come inside the main memory. But now you are at the secondary memory. So IO module is waiting for you to come in. You means your process to come in the main memory. But you cannot come into the main memory until unless this IO gets completed. So that is one kind of deadlock. Single process deadlock. It is called single process deadlock. Okay. So now to avoid this type of deadlock, for an example, you want to load data at particular virtual addresses, like from 1000 to 1500. Suppose that is the virtual address range where you want to load the data from the secondary memory. So when your process which is blocked on that IO, though it is blocked and it is swapped out, but not the whole, it is not fully swapped out. At least it should keep those pages in the main memory of those virtual addresses where you need to load the data. So that is one way to avoid the deadlock. But it would be more efficient to perform input transfer in advance of request being made and to perform output transfer sometime after the request is made. Okay. The better solution, rather than keeping some of those pages in the main memory while swapping out other pages of the process, rather than doing that, we can do something better than that. And what is it? Rather than loading the data directly into the user space, your process space, let's put it in some system space that is basically buffer. So while you load the data, your process requests some data to be loaded, that will be loaded in the system memory, your kernel memory, that is called buffer. And once it is done, your process will be given the signal that okay, your IO is completed, it can be brought in back. Once it will be brought in back, whatever data it requested, which is right now there in the system buffer, that will be copied from system buffer into the user process space. Similarly, when you want to write data, you send that request, you put that data in the buffer, and from buffer it will be copied into the maybe in the hard disk or USB drive, that whatever your IO device is there. So now there is some buffer, and this technique is known as buffering. Now there are two types of devices: block oriented devices and stream oriented devices. Basically, how data gets transferred in form of blocks, like hard disk. Hard disk, when you read or write from hard disk, it is doing in a block form. A whole block will be written to the hard disk, or a whole block will be read from the hard disk. So in this block oriented buffering, information is stored in fixed size blocks. transfers are made a block at a time, and it can reference data by block number. So basically in file system, and when we will see actual or physical organization of the files on hard disk, at that time we will see these blocks, and it is used for disk and USB keys. So basically this block transfer, block oriented buffering, it is used for disk, hard disk and USB. Then you have stream oriented. It transfer information as a stream of bytes. Okay. And it is mostly used for terminals, printers, communication ports, mouse and other pointing devices, and most other devices that are not secondary storage. So the devices which are not secondary storage like USB drive or hard disk, okay, most of these are devices where stream oriented buffering is used. So if we talk about this buffering, let us talk how it works. It works if there is no buffer. So as I just told you, whenever your process requested some data to be loaded, okay, it will ask operating system to load that data, and that data will be simply loaded in your process. There is no buffer. But if you use buffer, single buffer, then there is a system space. This is some system space where actual data will be loaded first, and from here it will be given or it will be copied into the your process space. That is single buffer. Now if we talk about this transfer for block oriented single buffer, as there are two types of devices, block oriented device and stream oriented device. How this transfer happens, either in form of blocks or in form of stream of bytes. So in this case, input transfers made to buffer, whole block will be moved. So block moved to user space when needed. So basically this is a block of data. Now one interesting thing is, normally when block transfer happens, basically it is with the secondary storage like your hard disk or your USB drive, right? So for an example, you are requesting some block that, okay, I require this data and it is lying on particular block. So OS will give you that block. But what OS normally does, it assumes that, okay, if you require block number 5, very likely that you may require block 6 and 7, something like that. So what it will do, while it is loading block 5, and after it has loaded block 5 and it is moving that block to your process space, meantime, it is also loading block 6 and 7. It is also loading block 6 and 7. So it assumes that it may require, and with that, it is saving your time. Whereas in stream oriented single buffer, it is either line at time or byte at a time. Either full line is read or written or only byte at a time. Now, to better this idea, see, instead of single buffer, you can also use double buffer. Instead of single buffer, you can use double buffer, so that two operations can be done in parallel. Like this will be read here, okay, and then once this is read, let's say there is another buffer. In another buffer, this device can be reading further, and whatever is already read, it is being moved to your process. So in one buffer, whatever content is there, that content is being moved. It is being moved from system space to user space. And while it is being moved, another buffer which is empty, it is also reading some data. Or it can also write some data. So reading, writing can be performed in parallel, or multiple data can be read. So a process can transfer data to or from one buffer while the operating system empties or fills the other buffer. So that is double. Of course, when you have single buffer and double buffer will give you better performance. And when we say, even if double buffer are not sufficient, you may have a stream of buffers. You may have an array of buffers. And that is in circular fashion, like this. If you require more buffer, you can have array of buffers, and it is in a circular fashion. Now this buffering technique, IO buffering technique, it has its own limitations. So buffering smoothes out peaks in IO demand, definitely, but with enough demand, eventually all buffers become full and their advantage is lost. If all processes are continuously demanding data, IO, okay, ultimately all these buffers will be full. They will be full and you will lose the advantage of this buffering. However, when there is a variety of IO and process activities to service, buffering can increase the efficiency of the OS and the performance of individual processes. Though this is one limitation, that if all processes which are there and they are demanding IO, and because of that your buffers are full, you may lose some of the advantage. But normally, otherwise, it is actually providing better efficiency. So these are very small topics regarding this IO. And the important topic that we are going to start now, that is disk scheduling. And before we understand disk scheduling, what is disk scheduling? Let us understand disk architecture. Nowadays, though, we are using SSDs, static storage drive, okay, but previous to that, in fact, still we are using this hard disk. Even though hard disks are also, the technology which is involved in hard disk, they are also changing. So let us see a general disk architecture. Disk means hard disk. So the entire disk is divided into platters, that is circles. And each platter consists of concentric circles called as tracks. So you just think about this, that this is your disk. Okay. And these are the concentric circles. They are called tracks. So this is track 1, track 2, track 3, likewise. And further these tracks, they are further divided into sectors. You can see every circle you can divide like this, that is sectors. And normally in your hard disk, you don't have only one surface. You have multiple such platters. You have multiple such platters. And in some of the hard disks, you can write on both the sides of these platters. In some of the hard disks, you can write only at the one side. So different technologies are there. But when you combine all these platters, okay, at particular, for an example, let's say outermost concentric circle, right? So if you use only outermost concentric circle of all the platters, all the surfaces, then it creates one cylinder. So a cylinder is formed by combining the tracks at a given radius of a disk pack. So you can see this is disk architecture. This is the ARM assembly, and these are the read-write head, magnetic read-write head. So you can see in this case, there are two heads on both the sides. So you can read and write from both the sides of the disk. Platter, rather than disk, I would call it platter. This is spindle around which this disk rotates. Okay. So there is a circular motion for these platters, and there is horizontal linear motion of this head. Head can move in linear fashion. So one single surface is a platter. When you combine a particular track of all the platters, then it becomes a cylinder. Okay. Every track has blocks which are called sectors, and one platter has multiple tracks. Are you getting this disk architecture? I am focusing more on this because this topic is more important as by CATE perspective also. So this is disk architecture. This is how your hard disk looks like. Okay. And I hope you might have seen your hard disk from outside, but internally it is something like this. You have some ARM assembly and this read-write head. So disk performance parameters. Okay. Performance means how much time is taken to read or write, read to or read from or write to. So the actual details of disk IO operation depend on many things. Disk IO. A general timing diagram of disk IO transfer is shown here. Basically, these are the different timings which are involved in disk IO. First of all, if your disk is busy, you can't do anything. Your process can't do anything. So it is just wait for that device to be free. Once device is free, it is possible that there is a single channel to that device which is busy. So it needs to wait for channel to get into to work with that device. So that time is added because device is now allocated to your process, but channel is busy. So that time is added. Once channel is occupied for hard disk by your process, now there is a seek time involved. Now what is seek time? If I can show it. Okay, let me show it here. Seek time. It means this read write head which moves in this direction. Okay. Your data, whichever data you want to, let's say you want to read some data from the hard disk. The data that you want to read, it is on particular track. So this read write head need to move to that track first. It needs to move to that track first. And for that, this read write head, it will be doing some linear motion. It will go track by track and it will be stopped at particular track from where you want to read the data. And that time which is required for this read write arm to move is called seek time. So what is seek time? The time taken by the read write head to reach the desired track is called as seek time. It is the component which contributes the largest percentage of the disk service time. So seek time, then rotational delay. Okay, what is rotational delay? Once this read write arm is located, it is stopped at particular track. Now on that track, at which sector your data is. So to that sector has to come just below this read write head. So for that, this disk surface needs to rotate in a circular fashion. Maybe if this is the sector where your data is, so it will rotate in this fashion and it has to come below this. So rotational delay will be added. So it will take time and that is rotational delay. So seek time, then rotational delay, and finally data will be transferred. Whether you read or write, data will be, and that is going to take time. So ultimately your device, okay, when you work with hard disk, so many timing components are there. Mainly we will focus only this three because this is not in our hand. I mean, this is not what we are going to do because it depends on how many other processes are there and how they are assigned this device and all those. So our focus is on this three part. And if you see, I mean, if you read further, it says that seek time is the component which contributes the largest percentage of the disk service time. So disk service time, we are not considering this right now. We are considering only this part. For this time, device is busy, definitely. But the timing, when we say timing, how much time is taken by particular read operation or write operation, we consider this three times. Seek time plus rotational delay plus data transfer. And on these three, this is the largest component. This takes most time. Of course, there are some technology which are evolved and it has improved this timing. Lower the seek time, faster IO operation. Simple. If seek time is the largest component, if you can reduce this seek time, definitely your IO operation gets better. It gets faster. Rotational delay or latency. It is also called latency, rotational latency. It is the time taken by the desired sector to come under the read-write head is called as rotational delay or latency. And it depends on the rotation speed of the spindle. As I told you, maybe if your data is on this sector, once your read-write head is on this track, but this sector has to come under this head in whichever direction it rotates. So what is the rotation speed of this disk? It depends on that. So disk rotate at speeds ranging from 3600 RPM up to 15,000. So there is a different types of hard disk where you have different types of speeds. At this latest speed, there is one revolution per 4 millisecond. Now, if you consider this speed, 15,000 rotations per minute. So how many rotations per second, or if I want to find how much time will be taken for one rotation or one revolution, which is rotation actually. So if you calculate that, okay, in 1 minute, if it is 15,000 rotations, so for 15,000 rotation, if it is 1 minute, for one rotation, how much time will be taken? If you calculate that, you will come with this value, 4 millisecond. Okay, so now if I see that, okay, this one rotation can be completed in 4 millisecond, then on an average, how much rotation is required for any particular or desired sector to come under this read-write head on an average? If one rotation can be completed in 4 millisecond, on an average, how much time is required for desired sector? It can be anywhere. Desired sector can be anywhere. How much time on an average is required for desired sector to come under this read-write head? So normally when we find average, we divide the given value. So 4 divided by 2, and that will give you 2 millisecond. So thus on the average, the rotational delay will be 2 millisecond. Okay. And then finally you have transfer time. So seek time, rotational delay, and transfer time. Now transfer time is actual time which is taken to read data from hard disk or to write data to hard disk. So the time taken by the desired sector to come under the read-write head is called rotational latency. Fine, we have seen that. Now it depends on the rotation speed of the disk in following fashion. This transfer, okay, by mistake I have written it here because I need to write something related to transfer time. Transfer time, it depends on the rotation speed of the disk in following fashion. How it, so this is one formula, you have to accept it right now. We are not going to derive this formula. So what is transfer time? Number of bytes to be transferred. How many bytes you want to transfer? Divide by number of bytes on a track. How many bytes are there on single track? Into rotation speed in revolution per second. Rotation speed in revolution per second. So just apply this formula and you will get the transfer time. So finally, total time, okay, total average time for your disk operation, whether it is read operation or write operation, that is TS. TS is nothing but the average seek time. It is average seek time plus 1 upon 2R. That is your rotation delay, average rotational delay. That is why it is 1 upon 2R plus B upon Rn. That is your transfer time. So when you add all these components, that will be actual transfer. That will be the actual time taken for your disk operation. Now in GATE, so many questions are asked based on this also. Okay, this is how, what we have just discussed. We have discussed what are the timing components which you need to add to get the actual time taken by your disk IO operation. Okay. Now, few more timings. I mean, apart from these three, there can be some other factors, okay, which add into the access time. So in addition to the access time, this is called access time. Okay, seek plus rotation. Seek timing plus rotation delay, that is called access time. In addition to the access time plus and transfer time, there are several queuing delays normally associated with a disk IO operation, because other processes are there before you. So you need to wait for your turn so that you can access hard disk. So that delay will be added. So when a process issues an IO request, it must first wait in a queue for the device to be available. So wait for the device. This is queue. This is a queue. And you need to wait your turn to get the device. Once the device is assigned to the process, let's say device is assigned to the process, if the device shares a single IO channel or a set of IO channels with other disk drives, then there may be additional wait for the channel to be available. So this is another waiting. Okay, so these are the few other timings which are added in the actual time taken for your disk IO operation. But if we ignore this part, that we consider that device is given to you and channel is allocated to you, after that if we want to find out how much time is taken, then it is this plus this. This is access time, this is transfer time. So let us see a small example to compare this. Okay, So consider a disk with following specification and estimate the total read time. Now you need to estimate the total read time. Average seek time is given to 4 milliseconds. That is this TS. Average seek time, it is 4 milliseconds. Rotation speed is 7500 RPM. Okay. Now what is R? This R value. Okay. R is rotation speed, but it is per second. And what you are given, R value, you are given in minute. So you need to find this, you need to convert this value into second, per second. So how much it is? If I convert this rotation per minute into rotation per second, how much it will be? How you can find out this R value from this value? Dividing by 60. You just need to divide it by 60. And if you divide it by 60, it comes 125 exactly. So 125 rotations per second. 125 rotations, that is your R value. So you have TS, that is 4 millisecond. You have R, that is 125. Then you are given sector capacity or the size of the sector. So one sector, it can accommodate 512 bytes, and one track can accommodate such 500 sectors, and each sector contains 512 bytes. And you need to read a file of size 1.28 megabytes, that is 2500 sectors. You want to read, ultimately you want to read this much data. Okay, ultimately you want to read this much data. Now let us do some calculation. So this is interesting. Assume sequential organization. What we are assuming that on your actual the file that you want to read, that is sequentially organized on your hard disk. It means all the 2500 sectors that you want to read for your file, they are sequentially organized on your hard disk. That is our assumption. But in reality, they may not be. They may not be put on the sequential sectors or one by one. They may be scattered on different tracks on different sectors. That is possible. But first, let us assume sequential organization. That means all the 2500 sectors, per track you have 500 sectors. So how many tracks you need to read? My total size, file size is 2500 sectors. Per track there is 500 sectors. So how many tracks you need to read? How many tracks you need to read? Is it that difficult? 5. Basically 5 tracks you need to read. So now let us calculate something. Your average seek time is 4 milliseconds. Rotational delay is 4 milliseconds. So for an example, what I'm talking about is, let's say this is the track which you need to locate first, because from this track it starts. From this track your data starts, your file storage is starting. So first this read write head, it needs to move to this particular track, and that is seek time, and it is 4 milliseconds. It is moved to this. Fine. Now you need to locate the starting sector. That is rotational delay. And rotational delay is 1 upon 2R. Rotational delay is 1 upon 2R. So R is 125. R is 125 revolutions per second. It is revolutions per second. And 1 upon 2R, if you calculate, that is 1 upon 2 into 125. That is 1 upon 250, but that is 250, it is in milliseconds. Sorry, it is in seconds. So you just need to convert it into milliseconds. So above in numerator, you will have 1000, because 125 is revolutions per second. And we are finding values in millisecond. So 1 upon 250 millisecond, and that is 4 milliseconds. 1 second divided by 250, that is 1000 millisecond divided by 250, and it will come to 4 milliseconds. So average seek time to locate the first track, it takes 4 milliseconds. On that first track, to locate the starting sector, it takes on an average 4 milliseconds. Once that sector is located, now all the data is sequential. So you need not to do any further seek time or rotational delay. And one more thing that you need to add, to read that first sector. Okay, sorry, read 500 sectors, one track. How much time is required to read one track? How much time is required to read one track? That is 8 milliseconds. Why? Because that comes from this formula. It comes from this formula, transfer time. You want to read one sector. One sector means you want to read one track first. First track. First track contains 500 sectors. Okay. So B is the number of bytes to be transferred. That is 500 into 512. 500 sectors. Each sector contains 512 bytes. So 500 into 512. But then N, what is N? Again, it is number of bytes on the track. So B and N are same actually. For the first track, B and N are same. So this will be cancelled out and it is 1 upon R. It is 1 upon 125. So it is 8 milliseconds. And that is why your first track read that you want to do, it will take 16 milliseconds. And after that, the remaining 4 tracks that you want to read, there is no need. There is no need for seek time. Only rotational delay. Only rotational delay and reading the whole track. 500 sectors means one track. So for remaining 4 tracks, there is no seek time required because your read write head is at the proper position and it will be moved in that particular position and no more seek time is required because all tracks are consecutive. So only first track reading requires 16 milliseconds and remaining 4 requires 12 milliseconds. So it is 16 plus 4 into 12. In total, 64 milliseconds. In total, it is 64 milliseconds. Are you getting this calculation? But if we assume that there is random organization and it is not sequential, then for every sector you need to find, seek time will be added and delay, rotational delay will be added for every sector. And how many sectors you need to read? 2,500 sectors. So find out one sector values. So 4 millisecond for average seek, rotational delay is 4 millisecond. If you do such calculation, you will get 0.016 millisecond for one sector. So for one sector, total time is 8.016 millisecond, and you have 2,500 such sectors which are randomly or scattered. So it requires 20 millisecond, 20.04 millisecond. And you can compare if it is sequentially organized and if it is randomly organized, what is the time difference. So this is one perspective. It gives you time comparison. Okay, now we will start with this scheduling policy. Okay, before that, let us understand why we require these policies. So it is clear that the order in which sectors are read from the disk has a tremendous effect on IO performance. Okay. In the case of file access, in which multiple sectors are read or written, we have some control over the way in which sectors of data are deployed. And we shall have something to say. So this topic we will discuss in the next chapter, how actual file is stored on the hard disk, physical organization. However, in the case of a file access, in a multi-programming environment, there will be IO requests competing for the same disk. There can be multiple processes which are doing some IO from the same disk. Thus, it is worthwhile to examine ways in which the performance of disk IO can be improved over that achieved with purely random access to the disk. So now our focus, whatever is, forget about this physical organization. There can be some possibility to improve the disk IO operation performance by using certain policies, because not only this organization affects the final timing, but also the when you have multiple processes which are waiting for the same disk and need to do IO on that, that has some impact. Okay, that has some impact. So what kind of impact can be there and how we can handle this impact and optimize the timing, that is our goal. And for that there are different policies. Okay, so disk scheduling policies, we are taking one example for that first. Whatever policies are there, we will be discussing those policies using some example. So for that you need to have a setup. So to compare various schemes that we are going to discuss further, consider a disk head is initially located at track 50. Initially your read-write head is located at track number 50, and assume that your disk is having total 200 tracks starting with 0 and at the ending at 199. So total 200 tracks are there in your hard disk. Okay, and that the disk request queue has random request in it, and the disk request queue, multiple processes has requested some operations on that disk which has 200 tracks, where initially your read-write head is located at track number 50. And what are the requests? Which tracks are being requested from different processes? So these are the values. The requested tracks in the order received by the disk scheduler are this. One process requesting 82. The next process is requesting track number 170. Next process is requesting track number 43. Okay, so multiple processes has sent this request of different tracks of your disk. With this example, we will discuss all the policies. Simplest policy, first in, first out. First in, first out, which is the simplest. So first, go to the 82 track, do the read write, whatever is the request, do that. Then go to track number 170, do the request, complete the request, go to 43. That is first in, first out, and it is a fairest policy. So in that process, request sequentially, and it is fair to all processes. It approaches random scheduling in performance if there are many processes. See, if this list is very high, okay, if this request number, the number of requests are very high from multiple processes, then this first in, first out, it behaves similar to the random scheduling. Random scheduling means you can serve randomly any request from the queue, and that is very similar to first in, first out if this list is very long. But if I can show it here, so you can think that this is your tracks from 0 to 199. Initially your read write head is at 50. The first request that you serve is 82. So from 50, your read write head need to move to the track number 82. So this seek time will be added. Seek time of this will be added. From 82, it will be moving to 170. See, so further from here to 170, seek time will be added. So we are going to find out total seek length. And why we are focusing on seek length only? Because that is the maximum time which is there in the disk IO operation. Seek time is the largest component compared to rotational delay, rotational latency and transfer time. Seek time is the largest component. So we are focusing only on seek time, and we are trying to see the policy. We are trying to work out with the policy where we can get less seek time. But if we use FCFS, first come first serve, or FIFO, that is first in, first out, then in this particular example, what is the seek length from 50 to 82? So it is 82 minus 50. From 82, it is going to 170. So it is 170 minus 82. From there, it is going to this. So 170. So if you find out all this seek length, it comes to 642. This is the seek length. So whatever seek time is required to move this many tracks, that is there. So this FIFO has some advantages. Every request gets a fair chance, because in whichever order request has come, in that order it will be solved. And no indefinite postponement, because wherever you come, in that order you will be served. So your request will not be postponed, or there won't be any starvation. But it has its own disadvantages. It does not try to optimize seek time, and that is what we want actually. We want to minimize this value. We want to minimize this value. Okay, it is like, some very simple idea. What we are trying to achieve, let's say you have some job to be done in Ahmedabad, Then you have some job to be done in Gandhinagar. You have some job to be done in Mehmedabad, and you have some job to be done in Nadiad. And right now, and you have some job to be done at Baroda, suppose. So you need to do some jobs in Baroda, Nadiad, Ahmedabad, and Gandhinagar, let's say. And right now you are at the Anand. Right now you are at the Anand. But the order in which these jobs come, they are very randomly. Let's say first job comes, it is for Gandhinagar. So first from Anand to you will go to Gandhinagar. The second job, it is in the Baroda. So from Gandhinagar, you go back to Baroda and do the job. And from Baroda now, the third job comes, it is for the Ahmedabad. So again from Baroda to Ahmedabad, you will go. So you can think how much time you are wasting in the traveling. But instead of that, if you know all these jobs, that okay, I have this many jobs at this places. So what approach you will take? You won't go by FIFO order. Okay, this job is requested first, so I will do that first. No, that is not going to save your traveling time. What will save your traveling time? Particular order you follow, that it will save your time. Maybe you go in one direction. You are at Anand. First job you will do in Nadiad, you complete that. Then you do the next job in Ahmedabad, you complete that. Then you do the next job in Gandhinagar, you complete that. Then you go there to Baroda, maybe. And that will save your traveling time. Do you think so? Do you agree with this? So we are going to see different strategies which use this idea, but this FIFO has its own problem. It does not try to optimize sick time, may not provide the best possible service. There is some other scheme which is based on priority, and this priority actually is not trying to even optimize this sick time. It is not bothering about that. Here, when you use priority based policy, goal is not to optimize disk use, but to meet other objectives. Okay, the example that I just described, that you have jobs at different cities, then your priority is not to minimize your travel time. What is the priority? Which job is more important? Maybe which job is paying you more, something like that. So that is your priority. Minimizing travel time is not your priority. So in that case, if the job which is at Baroda, if that is giving you highest payment, maybe you do that first. And the next job at Ahmedabad giving you the highest payment. Then you go from Baroda to Ahmedabad. Then you may come from Ahmedabad to Nadia. Then again you go from Nadia to Gandhinagar. So you don't worry about travel time. Your priority is not minimizing the disk utilization, not optimizing the disk utilization. Your priority is something different. Maybe short batch jobs may have higher priority. It provides good interactive response time. Larger jobs may have to wait an excessively long time. That is the case if you give priority to short batch jobs. And this, it is a poor policy for database systems. So, but that is there. This priority based scheme, if you use, it is not going to, because you are not worrying about optimizing disk operation. You are more focused on the some other priority. So it is also there. So FIFO is there, priority is there. Then LIFO is also possible. LIFO is just the reverse of FIFO. You know that LIFO. And if we use the same example, okay. So you can see here, the device is given to the most recent user, so there will be little arm movement. Now, why it is going from 50 to 190 first? Because what is our example? 190 is the last request. So it will be served first. Initially, your read-write head is at 50. So it will serve the last request first. So from 50 to 190, from 190 it will go back to 16. From there it will go to 24. There it will go to 140. Likewise. So 190 to 50 to 190, then 16, then 24. So this is LIFO order. This will maximize its locality and resource utilization, because there is one possibility that requests which are coming, maybe they are coming, new requests which are coming, they are in the same locality. That is the assumption. That is the assumption. And if you use that LIFO order, it is quite possible that the latest requests which are coming, they are in the locality, in the same locality. So of course it will save your traveling time. That is your seek time. But possibility of starvation, because if new jobs are getting added in this queue, if new jobs are getting added in this queue, they will be completed first, and maybe some older jobs need to wait for a longer time, or even this new jobs are keep coming, maybe these jobs may not be completed, and then in that case the older jobs may feel or may face starvation. That is one possibility with LIFO. So possibility of starvation, since a job may never regain the head of the line. But this is the total sick time that you achieve in this particular example. Okay, you cannot always generalize this policies, you cannot compare these policies and generalize something. Of course there are few points, but currently for this example there is 754 sick time. In case of FIFO it is 642. That's just a number in this particular case. Then there is another policy called shortest service time first. Shortest service time first. Now this is little interesting. Select the disk IO request that requires the least movement of the disk arm from its current position. Basically we are trying to minimize the traveling from this point wherever I am. For which job I need to travel least, that is my next request that I will complete. So in the same example, you are at the 50 initially, so 43 is the job at the track number 43. That job is going to take least time, shortest service time first. So seek time or shortest seek time, in some case it is also called shortest seek time. So that will be done first. From after 43, 24 will be done, then 16, and likewise. And not necessary that is always in one direction at a time. Okay, let's say after 43, if it is 47, suppose, I mean not 47, but in that case that is possible that it may be changing. And if you complete this, if you find out this value, it comes to 0. So now you can see drastic change. If you compare this value with FIFO and LIFO, which is in 600 and 700, this is very less. So this is better in that sense. This is better in that sense. What are the advantages? Average response time decreases. Average response time for every request, average response time gets decreases because they need not to wait much. And throughput increases definitely, because less seek time means throughput gets increased. But it has its own disadvantages. Overhead to calculate seek time in advance. Okay, in advance you need to find out all the seek times, and you need to use the list seek time to get your job done. It can cause starvation for a request if it has higher seek time as compared to incoming request, because requests are still coming in the queue. And if there is one job which has very high seek time compared to every other request which are coming, maybe that particular job may face starvation. High variance of response time as SSTF favors only some requests. So, for every request response time, the difference in the response time of every request may be very high, because this SSTF favors only those jobs, those requests which are nearby. So the far away jobs, they will have very high response time. They will be completed after a long time. So that is SSTF. Similar to this, very not exactly not same, but there is another policy which is called scan policy. Arm moves in one direction only, satisfying all outstanding requests until it reaches the last track in that direction, and then direction is reversed. Though in this example or SSTF, you may see that it is moving in one direction and then it completes the other direction. It just happened in this example, but this is not necessary that it is always like this. It may be like zigzag depending on the distance. But here in scan, it is completely based on that. It will move in one direction first, complete all the requests in that direction, and then move in the another direction. That is scan. It is like elevator. This is also called elevator, because elevator goes in one direction and then goes in the next reverse direction. So though 43 is the nearest job to 50, but here it is assumed that your current trend, your read write head, it is moving from current position to the higher track number. That is the assumption. That is why it is going from 50 to 199. And all these requests which are in the same direction, they are completed. And then it will reverse, and whatever requests are in this direction, they will be completed. And if you see this, here seek time is more than SSTF. Here it is 208, but here it is 332. So little higher than that. What is the advantage of this algorithm? High throughput, low variance of response time. This is important. Low variance of response time, which is high in SSTF. For every request, the difference in the response time, it can be high in SSTF, but here it is low. And response time is average. Disadvantage is long waiting time for request for locations just visited by Discom. This is interesting. For an example, let's say you are moving in this direction. You have reached to this point and there is a new request come for 100 or maybe 83 or 84, which is passed out, which is just passed. Okay. So now this request, which has just come and currently it is going in this direction. So it has to wait when it will reverse the direction and come at this point. So long waiting for this new request. Long waiting for that. And look is very similar to scan. This look is very similar to scan. The only thing is it will not go from current position to the end of the direction. It will go only to the last request in that direction. That is look. It is same as scan, but last request in this direction is at 190. So it won't go up to the 199. That is the end. No, it is not going up to that. It will go only up to 190 because in this direction, 190 is the last request. Then it will reverse, and it will in this direction also, it will go only to the last request in that direction. So here if you compare scan and look value, in scan it is 332, in look it is giving 314. Not big difference, but of course some difference is there. So thus it prevents the extra delay which occurred due to unnecessary traversal to the end of the disk. Okay, no need to go in this part from 190 to 199. Why? Because there is no request in that part. So let us come reverse from this part itself. And no need to go to 0. Why to go to 0? Because last request in this direction is at 16. So stop at there. So this is little modification of scan, which is called look. Which is called look. Then there is C-scan and further C-look, which we will discuss in the next lecture. So what is left in this IO part now? This few strategies, C-scan and C-look, and then there is end step scan and F-scan. 4 algorithms, four policies are left in this particular chapter, and not chapter, in this particular topic. And after this we will start file system or maybe RAID. I'll check. Okay, so that we will discuss in the next lecture, and I'll try to complete this chapter in the next lecture.